Galacta has hit Marvel Snap with a bang. Let's take a look at the best decks to play Marvel Snap's newest season pass card in. With a 4-6 stat line, Galacta has a relatively on-rate body as far as 4-cost cards go, but it's her effect that you're really going to be playing her for, giving +3 power to the first card you play at a location that is not her location on each turn of the game. This means that Galacta scales the earlier you can get her out. Many of the decks playing Galacta are going to be playing cards like Psylocke and Zabu in an attempt to get her out on turn 3. Outside of that, you're going to see decks that are looking to multiply the effectiveness of her buff, with cards like Brood and Sebastian Shaw being far better than normal when it comes to being paired with Galacta. On the whole, she strikes me as a card that reminds me a little bit more generally applicable Miss Marvel. I've seen a lot of noise around the potential for this card to get nerfed. I think her most problematic interactions are pretty clearly the Brood ones, and I'm not sure that's really nerfable per se. I think it's more about the general power level of what she's able to put out. To me, this card feels lower power than the release version of Agent Venom that we got. Frankly, I'm not sure she's even better than Anti-Venom or something like Wiccan, but I do think that she has a very unique niche as far as the power she can output and the ways in which she synergizes with certain things. The ability to ramp her out on turn 3 ends up being quite crucial, but having played with this card a decent amount, even in decks that she is obviously amazing in like Silver Surfer, I have not gotten the impression that this is a particularly nerfable card, and if it is, it's like the kind of nerf where they maybe take 1 power off of it and it stays in all the decks that it was already going in. With all of that said, let's jump into taking a look at some of the decks this card excels in. You all already know how I feel about Galacta Surfer. I think this is obviously her home that she is the most guaranteed to stay in. When it comes to a card like this, if people are worried about it getting nerfed, I think it's worth talking about the deck that I am positive she'll be in no matter what happens to her, basically, and that is Silver Surfer. The Brood interaction is so completely incredible that I think this card is going to be a Silver Surfer staple no matter what happens. The ability to play Galacta on 4, Brood on 5, Absorbing Man the Brood on 6, basically gets you to infinite levels of power on that Absorbing Man, which is going to be 7 times 3, 21. If you manage to play a Forge on the Galacta lane before playing that Brood is also going to get up to 7. This is a deck that previously was limited very heavily by the amount of power it could output, and now has massive power output on the final 2 turns of the game. Being able to play effectively an Infinite on turn 5 and an Infinite on turn 6 in a deck that previously wasn't really able to get much over 20 power into lanes is a godsend. I think the only way she could ever end up leaving a deck like this is if they take her and say she only gives +2, which I don't think you can do as long as she stays at 4. This is her safest home. So if you are looking at buying this card, this is a deck I think you're probably going to want to make sure that you actually like playing in a world where it is possible she gets nerfed and I'm wrong about her. Moving on to the mid-range piles. Since Galacta is a card that just has good stats, in a similar way that Anti-Venom just has good stats, it's very simple to just put her into a deck that is already playing a bunch of strong cards and play her as simply a 4/12 that you are happy with playing. We've seen Malekith effectively be in this role in decks like this before. I hardly think that she's irreplaceable here, but she's just going to be adding a bit of extra ability to go tall. And because so many people are playing her, that extra ability to go tall ends up being a little bit more relevant than it otherwise would be, because every deck that is playing just a Galacta in their good cards pile is now going a little bit taller than they otherwise would be. I'm not saying that's permanent state of affairs, but it does mean that she has a more relevant home right now just because more people are playing her, and if you're playing a mid-range deck and other people are playing mid-range decks, you're going to want to be able to match them on power. I think she's quite solid in shells like this, and this is where, if you're looking for long-term viability, I would keep an eye on if she stays in here, because bluntly, Marvel Snap players have shown themselves to be a little bit fickle. There are a lot of good options for these decks, and a lot of the time what happens is like, oh, the one that just came out, that's the best one, let's play it. And it's like, okay, maybe it's the best one, but it's like by 1%, it's hardly worth buying the card for that. and I'm not sure if this version of Galacta is going to be the kind of thing that sticks around permanently, or if it's just a flavor of the week, and then when Doom 2099 comes out, we have a better way of outputting points, and we're just going to be doing that instead. I think that's entirely possible. What I really wanted to get at here, though, is the inclusion of Zabu in a lot of non-Silver Surfer Galacta decks is going to be something you're going to see a ton. This is a deck that is looking to get her out early because it actually matters a ton when you get her out early. Silver Surfer doesn't care as much about that because you play a Brood on 5, Absorbing Man on 6. You have all these ways of getting extra value out of your Galacta buffs in a Silver Surfer deck, but a deck like this cares a ton about getting as much value as you can out of Galacta because you're not really multiplying the effectiveness of the buff with any of your cards. You're just playing her for numbers, and so the earlier she gets out, the earlier you can start getting those buffs down. Another version of this list was cooked up by Derek, and it differs in that it doubles down. It has Psylocke in addition to the Zabu in order to really try to get Galacta out earlier, and then has a bit of a higher curve in order to facilitate the addition of that Psylocke, so you can actually play a little bit more in terms of, like, you know, a 5-on-4 after playing Psylocke on 3 kind of deal. You can do a lot of that kind of stuff with this list, so the curve is a little bit higher, the power level is a little bit higher, but the consistency is a little bit lower. This deck is definitely looking to aim for those high rolls more often than not. The Zabu and Psylocke, if they're not doing something incredibly powerful, tend not to really pull their weight, and the more you invest in that stuff, the more it's important to actually pay that off on a game-to-game basis. Make sure you're getting appropriate value out of playing your 2-2 and your 1-2, because if you're not actually getting that appropriate value, and usually the best thing to do is to use them to play an early Galacta, and if you're not doing that, we start to get a little dicey, then they become not necessarily the best inclusions to have in your deck. However, the power when it does happen is meaningful, and it typically tends to be worth it in order to get a Galacta out early. So when that does happen, you are operating on a simply higher level with a more consistent early Galacta than the other mid-range decks looking to do the same thing. Using a similar core but taking it a different direction, this deck is also trying to leverage the power of ramp with Galacta. You not only have a Galacta in order to ramp out early, you also have the ability to ramp out a Wiccan early. This is a deck that is, you know, very hit or miss. When you're missing your 1-drops early, your Wiccan is off, everything is terrible. When you're hitting your 1-drops early and ramping out those early Galactas, those early Wiccans, it's a big hit. And so this deck is very, very close to, I won't say unbeatable, but it's like going to have very high output for a mid-range deck as opposed to other versions of this kind of stuff when it hits. But when it misses, it's kind of just doing stuff. It's doing Galacta stuff, which, don't get me wrong, that's a great backup plan to have. Just doing Galacta stuff is a better backup plan than the Wiccan deck has ever had before. But there is still some work in terms of trying to figure out what the best Wiccan Galacta shell is. What if it actually involves Quicksilver? So then you can actually play your Psylocke on 2 into a guaranteed actual 4-drop there. I don't know. I really don't know. It's possible that the inclusion of Zabu is just too good and you want to play Zabu, so you don't want to play Quicksilver. I know that I felt like 3 1-drops in here definitely left me without Wiccan a decent amount of the time. And I'm not saying playing Galacta mid-range is that bad, but, like, why are you playing Wiccan if you aren't going to have, like, a really good chance at activating him is sort of how I feel about this deck. I will also note the Hulkling here. The Hulkling was something that Derek and Butt cooked up, but there is someone on ladder who's been playing Hulkling for a while. That's Chamo. I personally am not the biggest believer in it. I think it's just the kind of thing that you use to juice cubes out of people some of the time. But I also think that you can very easily look at this Hulkling and be like, okay, that should be Magneto. Okay, that should be Eliath. I don't want anyone watching this video and going out and crafting Hulkling because they watched it. You can very easily be happy with a 15-power Magneto or a 13-power Eliath off of your Galacta and feel very, very good about that. Please don't feel the pressure to go pick up a Hulkling for this. When Galacta released, it seemed fairly clear that she made a lot of sense with cards like Captain Marvel, maybe with cards like Kitty Pryde, and this is a list that tries to double down on having both her and Hope Summers in here, so you can get extra additional power in various lanes while also getting extra energy. This is a list that looks like it should have Elsa Bloodstone. Don't worry, we have an Elsa list on here, we'll get to that. But this is also the kind of list that I think is one that makes a lot of sense intuitively to me, where we've taken an older shell, this Galacta, this non-Galacta mid-range Thena shell, that has needed some help for a little bit because it's, only been an anti-venom deck for a while. This is a little bit of a throwback, but it allows that deck to have a bit of an end game with some beef that they previously was relying on Iron Man and stuff like that to get. We have real power here with Galacta, the ability to have cards that move, Hydra Bob, and of course Captain Marvel. Getting buffs like this is really meaningful. Thena is still a very big threat. And of course we have a Shang-Chi in this deck, which is going to be relevant, especially given how many people are giving their cards +3 power right now. I think this deck has some juice, and I'm really interested to see. One thing I really like when new cards come out and they make old archetypes or sort of recontextualize old archetypes, because Thena has been pigeonholed as an Agent Venom card for a very long time now, and it doesn't have to be anymore. And I think that's really nice. Also, selfishly, I'm a big fan of Kitty Pryde decks, and I'm just happy to see her getting some more play. I've always loved Kitty Pryde. She might be my favorite card in the entire game. And I do think that I am a little bit biased towards decks like this existing and towards being able to play Kitty Pryde and towards wanting to do things like this. I obviously have a little bit of a playstyle bias here that is probably affecting my recommendation of this deck, but I think it's pretty damn solid, to be honest with you. So I mentioned Galacta Elsa, and I think it ends up looking a lot like this. We have this ability to have a lot of things that benefit heavily from both Galacta and Elsa. Scarlet Spider getting to 8 is actually just crazy strong here. If you can get it to 10, that's also ridiculous, but it does make you a little more vulnerable to Shang. You have a bunch of ability to put power on stuff that can multiply it. And Galacta, I think, to me at least, her strongest shells are the ones that have access to this multiplicative factor. And I do think that's the reason I like Silver Surfer so much, is because it has access to Brood, because you can then Brood with an Absorbing Man. That's the stuff that makes her really ridiculous, to me, at least. And I think that having a mid-range deck with some of that in here is honestly pretty sick. I actually feel like when it comes to a deck like this, that maybe there's avenues that really haven't fully been explored. I wonder if there's like a mid-range deck that can just play Brood or Mr. Sinister and stuff like that. I don't know. That's one of the directions that I think this card could go in, because like Mr. Sinister as a 2/10 sounds really appealing for a deck that is trying to do stuff like this. Of course, it doesn't synergize with Elsa, so it might end up being the kind of thing that goes in the previous deck that we talked about rather than this one. And to that point, the previous deck that we talked about is making, I think, a little bit of a cold-hearted determination, which is basically, it's not worth playing Elsa when we have Galacta, when we have Gwenpool, we have stuff like this. I would rather be doing those cards. And I think long-term, it's very possible that that might get borne out. But I do like, if I am going to be someone who's investing in Galacta via playing something like Scarlet Spider, I like having a second way to make that card good as well. And that is what Elsa is doing here. We can't really talk about this card without talking a little bit about Arishem. It's a 4/6 that makes all your other cards you play after it very good. You are very interested in that in basically every Arishem deck. I'm showing Arishem Thanos here, specifically because Thanos is going to have more stuff to do a lot of the time. Normal Arishem decks, maybe it won't really matter all that much, but in Thanos, you're always going to have, you're never missing your curve in this deck unless you're really not drawing well. You have all of your stones that are going to be able to draw you more cards and carry the buffs from this. You're more able to split power and determine where you want that Galacta stuff to be able to go, because you're more likely to be playing multiple cards on the turns after Galacta. I generally think, though, that she's probably going to end up in every Arishem deck. It is a little hard to fit her in, though. You are giving stuff up. You'll notice we don't have Loki, we don't have Quinjet, we're doing, the wave into Thanos thing instead. I do think there is maybe something to be said for the fact that this is a hard deck to actually fit stuff into, and she might not go in every build of it. But I find it hard to believe that she's actually terrible here. I actually find that straight up impossible to believe because of the power of getting her out so early. I think Arishem being able to do that basically for free, it means that there's basically no way she's ever going to be bad here. She's going to be very, very good in whatever Arishem deck you choose to play, is my suspicion. So what's the move? In my opinion, Galacta's a pretty easy purchase. She's an even easier purchase if you like Silver Surfer, which I do think is going to be long-term her most consistent home. I have some worries about whenever a new card that just has good stats comes out and it goes in all these mid-range shells and everyone is like, wow, this card is really good in all those mid-range shells. And it's like, yes, but also those mid-range shells are really good without those cards. And so will this get replaced by the next cool stats 4 drop? I have some worries about that with basically every other deck that I've shown you today. I have absolutely no worries about that with Silver Surfer. She makes that deck incredibly strong. She's a good part of it. If you want to play Silver Surfer, you're going to want to pick her up. And if you want to try her in all these other mid-range strategies, I think that's probably a very safe home for her too. I think it's likely that she ends up being a relative permanent fixture of Arishem as well. Those are the places, when I try to evaluate a new card, I try to evaluate, like, where is this going to be forever? Where is this going to be in the current meta? A lot of mid-range decks and also this stuff. And then where is it going to be forever? And I think it'll probably end up in those spots forever due to those structural differences here. If we end up getting to a point where, like, Zabu and Psylocke are just not worth running, this card ends up getting a lot worse, I think, in those mid-range shells because accelerating it out is such a big part of them. Almost all those mid-range shells were running Zabu. Almost the ones that weren't. Actually, no, they were basically all running Zabu, and then there were, like, most of those were then also running Psylocke. And I think that's important to understand, like, why people are so high on this card. They're investing pretty heavily in it right now. And when you invest pretty heavily in something and get a good reward out of something, it's easy to look at the card and say, oh, it's because of that card. But people are really going out of their way to make her work right now. And there's an entire possible world, in my opinion, where that ends up not being worthwhile in the long term. Whereas Arishem and Silver Surfer, she's always going to be in, period. As far as picking up this card, I generally recommend it. The Season Pass is always the best value in the entire game to do, so I do think that's like a pretty easy recommend for me. $10 for a good Series 5 is basically getting a Series 5 for, like, God only knows how much % off. It's basically almost always a good decision if you are planning on playing this game going forward. I know people are worried about her being the next super broken Season Pass card. I don't think she's as good as Surtur. I don't think she's as good as Agent Venom. I think she's more in line with a card like Anti-Venom, a card like Malekith. She's similar to those more than she is to those two very, very powerful Season Pass cards, in my opinion. I think even in a world where she gets nerfed to 4 or 5, you still play her in Surfer 100% of the time. I'm not really worried about that kind of stuff. Her longevity seems to make sense. But also, I'm not really thinking she needs to get nerfed to 4 or 5 just yet. I know some of my friends are really on that train. I'm a little bit more cautious on it, and we'll see how things develop. But I think she's probably going to end up being like, okay, yeah, this is pretty okay. This is, like, fine to exist. It's just a strong thing to do. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through the video. Thank you so much for watching the video. As always, I've been KM Best. Please remember to like and subscribe if you liked what you saw here. As always, you've been phenomenal. Have a great one.